welcome to this evening's weekly webinar with Dr. Jonathan Rowson. And Jonathan, as you will have seen, is going to be talking about two kinds of spiritual bypassing. The second is less well known than the first, and so I'm particularly looking forward to his treatment of this. And you'll see that he's the founding director of Perspectiva. And this is committed to, as it says on the tin, as it were, understanding the relationship between systems, soul, and society in theory and in practice, with a view to help overcome collective immunity to transformation in a time between worlds or between paradigms. And I think that the scope and work of Perspectiva is incredibly important because it takes into account these different levels and different types of system, and both the inner and the outer, the social and the spiritual, and the way that societies organize themselves. And he was previously a director of the Social Brain Center at RSA, where he wrote a number of research reports and had some very interesting consultations in which I and others were involved. And if you go back even further, you will see that part of his history was in chess. And I don't know whether he's going to be using any chess metaphors this evening, but if he does, I'm looking forward to some interesting moves. So, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome everyone. Good to see all your digital faces on my screen. I hope you're all well, and if you're in the UK, if you enjoyed your dinner, and if you're elsewhere, are enjoying whatever time of the day it is. So, as David mentioned, my name is Jonathan Rowson, and I'm the director of an organization called Perspectiva. And tonight we are going to speak about spiritual bypassing, why it matters, how it's best understood. And for that purpose, I have some slides, but these slides should be understood a little bit like the raft in the old Buddhist story that one uses to get across the river and then discards. I'm going to use them as a way of getting ourselves into the same world, as it were, to share some quotations. Most of them are just quotations, just so that we can begin to have some kind of convergence on what we're talking about, and a couple of conceptual tools to get hold of things. And once we have that shared world, then I'll come back to the more discursive take on what spiritual bypassing is and why it matters today that we understand it, and to some extent move beyond it. I'm conscious also that many of you won't know me at all, and I'm just another guy on the screen, just like you are for me at the moment. So just as a brief personal intro, I'm from Scotland. I grew up in Aberdeen. My childhood was marked by becoming a type 1 diabetic, which has been very salient in the context of COVID. I am now living in London, married to Shiva, who's from India. So sort of there's been a sort of Vedantic injection into my spiritual education from left field, as it were. I studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford as an undergraduate. A bit later, I went to Harvard and did mind, brain, and education. And then a bit later still, I did a PhD on the subject of what it means to become wiser. And throughout this time, I was sort of busking and just, traveling around free and easy playing chess. Chess was the means by which I survived my childhood, really. It was the process of sublimation in which I made sense of the world, built an adult identity, and through that, came to sort of love the mind and love the process of thought and where it led to. And that's a sort of very brief snapshot of who I am. But I'm now a father of 2 sons as well, and that's a big part of my daily karma yoga experience, which takes all sorts of forms, as parents here will know. So it's a great pleasure to actually be free, to have the door locked, and to be able to geek out on some rich philosophical concepts this evening. So, like I say, I'm going to turn to the slides just to get some shared experience, and then come back to what I think is going on with all of them. So bear with me if you feel a narrative arc is not yet developing. It will come in due course. So I'm just going to share my screen. Go here. search, and then here. Okay, you've all got that, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So that's just what you saw on the tin, as it were. That's my email address, our organization's website, and my Twitter handle. If any of you are on Twitter, you're welcome to follow. Okay, so the first quotation is from Jean Gebser. Some of you will recognize it. This is an important scene-setting quotation because Gebser, for those who know his work, is a great sort of mystic, prophet, visionary of the evolution of consciousness. He believes we're now in a phase of history where the sort of mental, rational structure of consciousness is breaking down. So if you feel that things don't make sense at the moment, Gebser sort of foresaw this. And they were entering a sort of, we're moving into something more like an integral phase of consciousness. But it's not a simple, positive development. It's something much more disruptive and turbulent. But he says our only hope, in effect, is some kind of spiritual awakening, and a new spiritual reality. So sort of the deep take here is history moves and our response is, broadly speaking, a spiritual one. So this has a lineage. This is only one quotation of thousands, but it's one that's particularly powerful in this context. I'm just going to move, there we go. And then a similar one, shorter and maybe sweeter, but no less important. So I'm predicting that we'll actually, that we might actually be foolish enough to destroy our only home, that there are forms of existential risk of the planet, that if we don't get spiritual in some sense, to be defined in a moment, that we will be, done for. Very different take, Hegel and Marx. You might think, wow, where did that come from? I was doing spiritual stuff and here come these guys. I'll get into this in some more depth later, but this is just in a way of, when David mentions systems, souls, and society, it's quite important to grasp that there is a view of what's driving history that's not just about the evolution of consciousness as a mere phenomenon of our interiority or of our relationship to the transcendent, but is also somehow driven by material forces, relations of production, economic structures, and all of this kind of stuff, technological forces. So the sense of the world at the moment is heavily mediated by what they call big tech. Many people's lives are being shaped by Facebook and Twitter, and reality is being constructed on the basis of people watching YouTube videos and TikTok and so forth. These have real effects on the world. They shape consciousness. These are important things. So when I say being haunted by Hegel and Marx, I'll get back to that in a second, but what I'm really alluding to is not to forget those underlying material economic conditions. They're part of the story. And now the author of a book on spiritual bypassing, Robert Augustus Masters, in that image, I think he looks like the archetypal wise man. And I like it. And this is an important quotation because it gets at the first aspect of spiritual bypassing, which again we'll return to, but the spirituality is not just a kind of feel-good, groovy emotion, escape from reality. It's not something about, candles in the bath and being all peaceful and mellow and positive. That true spirituality, properly conceived, is an altogether more demanding, exacting, fulfilling process in which we confront pain and encounter reality in its fullness rather than turning away from it and avoiding it. And then a little bit more context, Bruno Latour, writing in a book called Down to Earth, which is very much recommended. Latour is a sort of French sociologist, but he's very relevant in this context because he says, if you want to understand that sense of politics being, completely deluded and bizarre and somehow out of touch with what's going on, he says you can't really grasp it until you realize that we're in a phase of history where nature is talking back, in effect, where we're facing a shift in geological time. Now, there's a lot of literature on the so-called Anthropocene, but there's another term, Capitalocene, which is saying the issue is not human nature as such. It's actually that it's the sort of underlying forces of production and relations of production that drive the nature of the economy that drive our extractive pursuits and destroying the earth. And now we're at a moment where there's a sort of systemic feedback happening through climatic effects and other effects. And basically what that means for politics, the tour thinks, is that you get a kind of reality avoidant culture, and you get those who are trying to turn our attention to what's actually happening. But in general, the rise of Trumpism, arguably Brexit, many other forces are about not wanting to confront this stunningly unprecedented situation in which we realize that the very setting of our lives, the coherence and viability of our only habitat in the far reaches of space, is actually in question for the first time. And it's in question, moreover, broadly speaking, because of us. And even if it's not us personally, it's us because we cannot influence the powers that be. So that's what the tour is getting at. Again, it's just a contextual factor for when we come back to spiritual bypassing. Similar, just at a moment when we really have to be focusing, laser-like focus on, attending to our ecological emergency, we're anything but. We're extraordinarily distracted and diverted with technologies that are addictive by design. This is a lovely thing by Maria Ressa in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which again I thoroughly recommend. It's quite short, but it's extremely lucid and powerful. Just explaining that, again, a seismic change, an unprecedented world historical event happened quite recently, namely the internet was created. And it gave rise to a new axis mundi, new center of the world in the form of the mobile phone in our pockets. Now we sort of take these things in our stride and move on as if life's much the same. But what the tour and Ressa are saying in different ways is the world has fundamentally changed. Again, context for what spiritual bypassing might mean. Finally, looking like the arch Bond villain there, Thomas Metzinger has a lovely quotation here, where he in effect says that, and we may already feel this to some extent, that as time goes by and we're not distracted by major news events, however important they might be, and we notice that just year goes by after year, and we're not actually able to reverse the destructive habits that are causing our planet to collapse ecologically, that we'll begin to see ourselves as failing beings. It's a very, very strong statement, failing beings. If you look more closely at that quotation, he does say exceed the present cognitive and emotional abilities of our species, which poses the question, well, what are those abilities? And can we not improve them in some way? Is there not an underlying spiritual curriculum there that's being alluded to, right? So these are all just scene setting. Now, in that context, it's worth asking yourself, what game are you playing? Now, this is a very simple structure. It comes from a book by Hansi Freinack. Some of you might know the authors. Hansi's not a real person. He's a kind of invented fiction, but he's comprised of two main authors called Daniel Gortz and Emil Freitz. And together they write about political metamodernism, and metamodernism is another conversation, or it might come up in the questions. But in this book, they have this very simple but very powerful distinction between game denial, game acceptance, and game change, right? Now, so broadly speaking, game denial is the sort of underlying function of what most people think of as spiritual bypassing. Game denial is sort of saying, if only everyone was more like me, or if only everyone was nicer, the world would be so much better. Game denial is saying, I think everyone will just cooperate if we could only maybe shift consciousness somehow, or if we could only get everyone to meditate twice a day, or if only we could change this aspect of the education, or get everyone to do yoga, or get everyone to spend a year doing national service, which included some kind of spiritual training, everyone would get better and the world would heal itself. This would be called game denial by Hansi Freinack. He'd say, look, the world is awash with corruption and incommensurate values and competing commitments and vested interests. And while it's true that we can always appeal to our better natures and there's always scope to improve ourselves and society, it's not true that you can vanquish the darker, more difficult elements of life. So game denial, he spoke to me in a recent, this is Daniel Gortz, a recent interview on Perspectiva's YouTube pages about pressing the nice guy button. And it was just a joke, but by this he means some people think you can just make everyone better and that will sort of sort everything out. He's saying, no, not really. It's not that simple, which is not to disavow the idea of human improvement, but just not to expect it to be a panacea. The second notion is game acceptance. Now, this is more common in people who may well feel that the current setup we have of democratic capitalism, broadly conceived, in much of the Western world is as good as it gets. In other words, yes, we can tinker and yes, we can improve things marginally, but actually maybe capitalism will get its act together, maybe some kind of green growth will take place, maybe the technological changes will be sufficient that we can resolve our ecological crisis with the tools we already have. And maybe as people wake up to the extent of the crisis, democratic mechanisms will create the political will that makes that possible. Maybe. Game acceptance says things as they are more or less as they should be, and we don't need to change the game. We just need to play the game better. And by the game here, I mean a combination of the paradigm, the social imaginary, the system, and we can speak about that, what those different terms might mean later. But I think many people in my sort of network and community believe that we have to change the game. And by that, we mean that there's something about the nature of the economic and political order in the world today that is heading inexorably for some kind of collapse. And it might be relatively localized collapse in the first instance. It might be more severe. We don't really know, but we know that looking at the position, and since David wanted the chess metaphor, this is one way of bringing it in. You know, quite often as a grandmaster, you look at a chess position and you can tell several moves beforehand that a position is either hopeless or salvageable. And you can look at it and say that strategically, the expression we use is strategically lost. And it might not, one side might not be any material ahead, there might not be an imminent checkmate, but you can just see that the writing is on the wall. Now, a lot of people that I work with and liaise with feel this way about the state of the world today. It's as if we carry on with the same rules and the same objectives and the same players, broadly speaking, indefinite economic growth, national elections, not interfering in the private sector, controlling the public realm, which is part of the problem with big tech companies. If we just kind of hope that we'll muddle through, it's not going to work, and we will be heading for some kind of serious collapse. So this is the context in which the question of spiritual bypassing arises, because broadly speaking, those who would say we just need to get spiritual and everything will be fine are mostly doing game denial. Those who are saying things are more or less as good as they are, we just need to focus on the evolution of our souls, we need to focus on developing a certain kind of consciousness, we need to work on our own development, our own relationship with the transcendent. We don't need to get involved in economics and politics. That will always be somewhat fallen, somewhat dystopian. Our job is just to relate to God better and accept the game as it is. And there are others who feel, no, both of these things matter. We have to change systems, souls, and society, which is what Perspectiva's catchline is. We have to somehow find some way, because of this unique historical moment and the challenges it poses, to bring to bear our interiority as well as getting real with the systems and structures that shape our lives. That's the sort of overview. Now, some of you will recognize this. In fact, I imagine most of you will. Again, this is just to get some shared language. On the left, if you just focus on the image, what's on my left, I can't guarantee where it is for you, but the green one, let's say, the one that's got the circles, the concentric circles in it, that's the kind of ahistorical 4-quadrant map from integral theory, devised, I believe, originally by Ken Wilber. And it's a map of reality sort of distilled to its most essential elements. And it's, Wilbur actually called it the four faces of God. It's, quite a powerful way of putting it. And the reason I mention that now is that for many people, spirituality is pretty much entirely the top left. It's about your inner life, the subjective. For many people, spirituality is all about states of mind, perceptions and sensations, thoughts and emotions. For some, it moves down to shared values, meanings, language, relationships, and cultural background, bottom left. But for very few does it go to the bottom right: systems, networks, technology, government, and the natural environment. And this is part of the problem with spiritual bypassing. So one of the problems we have is that politically, the powers that be tend to exist almost entirely in the bottom right, and they pretty much ignore the top left and allude a little bit to the bottom left in various ways. And then science, which mostly speaks to the top right, comes in every so often trying to be objective, trying to give the fact of the matter. But depending on the power of the other influences, where people are, how things are communicated, we may or may not have access to that. So I share this just because it's a kind of distilled map of reality. Now, on the right is the same map, but this is extracted from an essay I wrote on metamodernism. It's a way of saying in the current historical context. So the one on the left doesn't really have history in it. Again, we can come back to this in the questions, but the problem with integral theory writ large is, although it's sequential and developmental, it's not really historical. It doesn't really deal with real historical events and all that they comprise. Whereas the image on the right is trying in a heuristic, somewhat playful, but nonetheless committed way to say that where we are at this moment of history is that we're in a phase of time where we have to contend with interiority, and more people are beginning to realize that, even in public life. On the top right, we're beginning to think ecologically, beginning to understand systems theory, complexity theory more broadly, process philosophy, giving rise to a view of reality in which the very idea of it or things in the top right doesn't seem to work. What we've got instead is a sort of system of relationships. So the objective world turns out to be a relational world with arguably subjective and intersubjective aspects. And the bottom right, we do have history. History is back. I mean, it was always there, but there was a period in the sort of cultural postmodern era where there was so much self-reference, and arguably it's still alive today. People are not thinking historically very often in public life. They're very much caught up in the immediate news cycle. And then intimacy, this term comes from the shared sense. There's a beautiful, remember my favorite book title ever, possibly. It's a book by Sam Mickey, and it's called Co-Existentialism. So you'll know of existentialism, but co-existentialism, a sort of new sort of variant of existentialism. The title is Co-Existentialism and the Unbearable Intimacy of Ecological Catastrophe. The unbearable intimacy of ecological catastrophe. That got me thinking that one of the things that's going on as we begin to feel the world unravel is a peculiar kind of intimacy between our shared sense of what are we going to do? Is this really happening? In the Tasting the Pickle paper that I wrote recently, I have a line in there where I say, are we really condemned to be the idiots who blame the bastards for the world falling apart? And by that I meant, we often feel like, surely we ought to do something. Surely it can't be the case that we're heading to this ecological catastrophe and we're getting distracted by news cycles and celebrity gossip. Surely that's not who we are. And yet through that, you find lots of other people feeling the same way. And that's what I mean by intimacy. It's a shared sense of history and being present and a witness to it. Now, the next slide, I will not, you'll be blessed, you'll be glad to hear go into this, but for those who are interested, you may have heard the term meta-crisis, you may not have done, but it's a way of getting a bit richer and deeper and more nuanced about what exactly the problem is. You know, what's the problem in terms of why isn't game acceptance okay? Why is it not okay just to muddle through? And the argument I develop in the paper called Tasting the Pickle is that we have a series of meta crises. Not, meta means many different things, but we have so many different forms of problem lurking inside our systems and structures. So much so that sometimes even in our very grammar, for example, we speak about what we have to do, but there is no viable we at a global level. There is no agency there. The language doesn't actually convey what needs to happen. We're not very good at seeing how things interact. Culturally, we're struggling to find a new code. Arguably, there's a kind of what my friend and colleague Zach Stein calls a catastrophic failure of intergenerational transmission in education. We're not managing to get the sort of cultural inherited knowledge and wisdom from one generation to the next. We are struggling with our very ideologies. Liberalism, arguably, much as we may love it in many ways, and I live through it in many ways, climate change happened on liberalism's watch. And this is why it's a line, our underlying mechanisms subvert their own logics. That comes from Rowan Williams. And then in metacrisis and epistemology, we're struggling to know the world adequately. It's not as intelligible as it once was. That's partly to do with what Timothy Morton calls hyper-objects, the fact that issues like the pandemic and climate collapse, they're not actually intelligible. We don't have what it takes to really make sense of them at scale. And if you look closely and look at the world from a bit more sort of game theory point of view, it would look like we're committing ecocide, and we're heading towards, we seem to have an underlying generator function, as Daniel Schmachtenberger puts it, which is suicidal, because we have competitive dynamics, exponential technology, and a kind of arms race to possess and control things that's likely to lead to a bad outcome. But meanwhile, we're struggling to make sense of the world. We're disabled by dissonance, that we're unable to make sense and act in a way that works for us. We want to imagine a new world, but arts and humanities funding is constantly cut. We're not encouraged to really rethink the world from first principles. Our sense of normality is sort of constraining us in that way. And finally, number 10, a weakness for one of two kinds of spiritual bypassing, which is what I'm meant to be talking about. But now we've got that context, I can leave you just with this to know that these are my sources. I think, David, you can probably share these later somehow, rather than dwell on them now. But just so you know that much of what I just said is unpacked more fully in these sources. And you can take a photograph of the screen, or you can wait to get an email about them later on. Right, so I hope that wasn't too much of a bombardment and a kind of conceptual avalanche. I know it might have been, but it's sort of necessary, because to make sense of the next part, some shared sense of context is necessary. And that was my attempt to share how I'm seeing the world at the moment, and why that's what I'm bringing when I speak about spiritual bypassing. Because on the one hand, as you saw from Gebser and Malraux, we need some kind of new spiritual consciousness. We need some kind of new mind, new soul, new spirit to grapple with the world we've created, to unmake some of the harm, to recreate or generate something new. And that's speaking at a planetary scale of the human species, which is historically situated on a planet in a cosmos. And when you start thinking at that level, you think, my God, it's beyond any of us. Like, we're just these fallible, earthbound individuals having cups of coffee and making toast, trying to make sense of how we survive as a species on this fragile, delicate, but singularly precious planet. And we don't, it's an aside and a footnote, but there's every chance that we're unique. There may be other forms of life on other planets, but it really could be that this one precious home called Earth is the site of what we call consciousness and sentience, and therefore all of that brings in terms of art and civilization and beauty and truth and goodness. And that's kind of what's at stake. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm not talking about an asteroid hitting the Earth, literally, as the film Don't Look Up, considers. I'm speaking about a sense of direction and the inexorable feeling, the feeling that if we don't change course, the very survival of the planet is up for grabs. It's not clear if we will survive as a species. Just to give some examples, in addition to the slow burning but increasingly accelerating climate impacts and the knock-on effects that has on food and water supply, there's now very serious concerns about the ocean and dead zones in the ocean compounding climate effects. But not just that, it's more about the impact that will have on culture and politics, and then the information sphere, what we're learning about, our access to shared reality being broken, and at the same time technology becoming more available, such that in theory anyone can buy a private drone, create their own biological weapon, attach it to a drone, fly it into a city, cause mayhem, and create all sorts of consequences. Now, I'm not saying that will happen tomorrow. I'm just saying that the world we've created is one in which it's very, very easy for things to go wrong and quite difficult for it to go right, which is why the spiritual premise is there. Again, I quoted them already, but Daniel Schmachtenberger puts it like this. He says, in a world of godlike technology, we need to become bodhisattvas. In other words, unless we grow commensurately, spiritually, with the technology, we won't be able to undo the ecological harm or cope as a civilization. We will. That's my reading of it. And then it's not exactly a chess player's reading, but what it shares with chess is the sense of the state of the current position is a bit misleading, because it can look like it's more or less calm and normal. But if you look into what's happening in the position, based on the rules and the logic of the position, it looks like a kind of precipice, and it's a very dangerous one, which is why the premise for the spiritual is so important, right? Take a breath. So that's why the spiritual question matters. I'm just going to remove these slides now so they don't distract us. I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, I'm back with full presence, I hope. Are you all still with me? I haven't tired you out too much. Okay, good. Right, so I'm going to go back 10 years now, briefly, to when I was working at the RSA, which David kindly mentioned. So in roughly 2009, I joined the Royal Society of Arts. It was my first proper job. Before that, I'd been a free and easy chess player. I'd written some books. I'd been a student. But this is my first proper job. It coincided with becoming a father. So I was sort of growing up, early 30s. And I came to realize that at the RSA, if you could raise funds for things, you could more or less do what you wanted. And so I got this idea, look, why are people struggling to speak of the spiritual in public life? And they would always do it with caveats. They would say something like, this film had aesthetic, emotional, and even spiritual resonance. Or they would always qualify the spiritual in some way. And I felt a bit uncomfortable at this. What's going on? And so I managed to raise funds on the premise that by rethinking human nature as more embodied, more social, more automatic, more ritualistic, we might use the sort of new science of human nature to understand the spiritual better, and that this would be of value to public life. Now that was the premise on which I raised funds. We had a 2-year project. There were several events. And time went by, and then I also did a lot of work on climate change while I was there. And later, a few years later, I created Perspectiva, moved to the present day. And only a few weeks ago did I sort of realize something with a bit of a kind of like bombshell moment. You remember the slide where I showed you Hegel and Marx? So if I can just go back a bit further to when I was a student in the sort of late 90s, with an essay crisis about part of Marxist theory, something called the relationship, and this is actually more spiritual than you realize, but just hold it. The economic base and the cultural superstructure. It's an important distinction in Marxist theory. It's really a question of what's driving history, right? Marx argues that history is being driven by the forces of production and the relations of production. Some of you will know it's about the relationship between classes. And he says this gives rise to other forms of structure, like the family, like religion, like the concepts that we use. And so there's a relationship always between the economy and the cultural superstructure. Why does that matter? Because what was going on for me at the RSA was I was just very, very frustrated by the limitations of what Marx would call the cultural superstructure. I was feeling, guys, you're running out of resources. Unless you speak of the spiritual, unless you bring in the metaphysical resources there, the forms of consciousness, the notions of religious experience, the forms of practice, the sense of spiritual development, the sense of spiritual community, the commitment to answering the fundamental questions about the nature, meaning, and purpose of life. Unless you bring those things into the party, into the game, the culture is not going to renew itself. It's not going to have what it takes to actually move beyond the current economic system. And the reason that's of relevance here is that, you see, what's going on there is the cultural superstructure is needed to shift the economic basis. And that's one of the key debates within this sociological terrain. What actually changes history? If we're now at a stage of history where we think, oh my God, what are we going to do? There's an open question. Do you change the economy? Do you regulate the big tech companies? Do you overthrow capitalism somehow? Like, what is your story of how we get unstuck? And some would say, well, you work on the spiritual. You somehow shift consciousness, and through that, you get better economic relations, and through that you get better institutions, and through that you get better governments. Maybe, but there's another force going the other way, which is that people are increasingly deprived of time and attention to even think of anything beyond survival. People are going to vote for people who will promise them things that they may not be able to deliver. People will be accessing the news through their own filter bubble, designed to extract data for profit. So in addition to the spiritual sort of we'll change consciousness and thereby change the world, there's also these economic and social forces will change consciousness and keep things exactly as they are. So the sort of light bulb moment for me was when I realized that, in a sense, what I was doing at the RSA was responding to Marx. I was sort of saying, look, what's going on here is we're not going to change the economic basis, the indefinite pursuit of growth that's destroying the fabric of ecological basis of life, unless we get some kind of cultural renewal. And we're not going to get cultural renewal unless we get more deeply into the spiritual, right? So that was where I was at, and that's what I was doing. So what happens vis-a-vis spiritual bypassing? So then, from that period of time, back in about the early 2010s, I got into lots of spiritual communities. You know, I met a lot of like-minded people, a lot of people who did think more or less that the pathway to avoid ecological collapse was a kind of spiritual renewal. And it started by independent, individual spiritual practice, maybe some kind of Sangha support, some kind of community support, giving rise over time to a shift in consciousness. But increasingly, I would look at these groups and think, yeah, but what are you doing about the way that people's consciousness is being shaped by the economic and technological forces in the world? So the first kind of spiritual bypassing I encountered, and I still encounter today, by the way, at a very high level. So I can say in all candor that, you know, we recently published Ian McGilchrist's extraordinary magisterial book, The Matter with Things, which I highly recommend. But my view personally is that on this matter, Ian doesn't fully get it, in the sense that the economic base is still just as important as the cultural superstructure. So you may well shift consciousness towards a more, in Ian's language, more right hemispheric, contextual, holistic, present, full view of reality. But meanwhile, Goldman Sachs and Facebook don't really care. You know, they're up to their own stuff. They're making their own profits, controlling the world as they do. and their governments are falling in line with them because that's where their sense of power is. So this is not any kind of counsel of despair, but it's just a way of saying that the reason we've alighted on system, souls, and society as our kind of tagline is that you've got to deal with two kinds of spiritual bypassing at the same time. On the one hand, you have to say, look, yes, cultural renewal, spiritual renaissance, absolutely. But you have to look at those four quadrants and think it has to happen in all of them. Our challenge is to bring the spiritual into every aspect of life. Now, how? Way beyond me, but that is clearly where the kind of argument leads. You have to think simultaneously of what kind of economic structure, what kind of political system, what kind of patterns of social relating, what kind of cultural artifacts will give rise to what kind of human forms of life. That's the work. And it's very exacting, difficult work. I confess I'm completely out of my depth. I just know it's what we have to do. And it means that you have to consult with people who are experts in different things, and they have to come together. So in my own work, I frequently feel frustrated because I'm speaking to economists and political theorists who don't really have much time for the spiritual at all. And I speak to spiritual seekers who feel that all of that economic stuff is just kind of dirty politics, keep it away. The next stage of historical evolution, the sort of hidden curriculum for us, is to develop the capacity to think of these things as all being faces of God, that they all matter, that whether you're campaigning for, and you can take your pick on the policies, but if you want, the sort of things that give me some hope in the world at the moment are thinking of the world in terms of bioregional redesign. So not thinking in terms of cities and countries, but rather beginning to reimagine how we build societies and cultures and institutions around features of the landscapes. Because ultimately our very physical being depends upon ecological health, which depends upon the health of bioregions, which means building life around streams and mountains and rivers and thinking in that way. At the same time, I'm also given hope by what's sometimes called cosmolocalism, which is a way of understanding that, yes, our agency is in our local temporal situated context. We cannot solve all the planetary problems at once from our desks, much as it might sound like we think we can. We can, however, act locally and in a way that is also global, because we can communicate online now in a way we could never have done before, to really share best practice, to mutually inspire, to be a global community who nonetheless has to act on their street, in their neighborhood, the best they can. And I'm also given hope by increasingly forms of female leadership and different ways of building organizations that are less patriarchal, hierarchical, and so forth. And I say that wanting to know more about what that means, and Perspectiva is exploring that a bit at the moment. So it's already happening. I have a colleague called Indra Adnan, she's written a book called The Politics of Waking Up, another Perspectiva Press publication. And in The Politics of Waking Up, she uses this term from the Indonesian language where she grew up, which is ada, or ada. I should probably correct my pronunciation, but it roughly translates as it is there. And it's a way of saying it's already happening. So I don't really despair. I think objectively, if you read the state of civilization and you look at it as a complex system, it really is teetering quite close to collapse. But I also see these countervailing motions of people rethinking the world, rethinking the human and what life is for, and using spiritual resources to make sense of that. Bigger visions of who we are and what life is for. And we have to keep on supporting that. And that may give rise to policies that give us proper energy supplies, so people begin to create their own energy at home. They may also be some kind of universal basic income, which may only work if it happens globally, which is very hard to conceive of in a world of Russia, China, Brazil, and all of the other forces. But again, you have to think of what will work and then begin to move towards it. Now, the last caveat before I open things up I hope I've made it clear what the two kinds are, because I've spoken around it quite a bit, but the two kinds of spiritual bypassing are, broadly speaking, forgetting that the spiritual questions matter at all. So considering the ultimate nature, meaning, and purpose of life to be off the table, to be only a matter for the private realm, to think that none of that is real, that we really are just secular, humanist, liberal people, and that's the best we can do. That's one form of spiritual bypassing. It's ignoring the spiritual entirely. That's fatal and wrong, and we shouldn't do it. But another form of spiritual bypassing is saying, forget the economy, forget the politics, forget the education system, just come back to the breath, think positively, attend to the health of your own soul. The world will take care of itself. I think that's also wrong, morally wrong. I think it's irresponsible. The world is beyond our agency, in a sense. There's only so much one can do. But somehow we're called upon to try. And the thing that's important to grasp is that if you look at that 4-quadrant map and think of it as the 4 faces of God, there is a sense in which the political work, the activism work, the cultural work is spiritual work broadly conceived. Now, of course, if you define spiritual too broadly, it loses all of its shape and loses all of its meaning. But nonetheless, anything that's concerned with a direct encounter with reality in all its fullness and all its glory, is worthy of the term spiritual. Anything that's reality avoidant, that seeks to evade or escape from reality, is not worthy of the term. Spiritual, as you know, from spiritus, meaning aliveness coming from breath. It's the very being of, life itself. So that's how I see it. These two forms of spiritual bypassing, equally problematic. Our job is to somehow chart a course between them, realizing the absurdity, the cosmic absurdity of it, given that none of us can do this alone. We probably can't even do it together, but we're condemned and blessed to try. So thanks very much, and I'll leave it to questions later on.
Jonathan, thank you so much. That's a brilliant analysis, I think, and also summing up this problematique, if you like, with these Marxian categories, which I wasn't completely aware of. I'm also of the economic foundation I was aware of, but the cultural superstructure, this idea of the cultural superstructure, and the need to address all these dimensions, or else you're bypassing one at the expense of the other, and supposing that that is adequate, which of course it's not. And that's very much your point. At a later stage, I'd love to have a conversation about cultural evolution, because there is a new strand of the Templeton Foundation grants on exactly that, on cultural evolution.
Oh, really? Okay.
So we might be able to collaborate on that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start with a question, interesting question from about the World Economic Forum, which I'm sure you have a view on. I certainly do. The WEF claims to have a game change plan called the Great Reset, which seems to address the inter-objective systems, government, natural environment. However, the Great Reset seems very top-down and authoritarian. I fear that everyone not on board will have their rights trampled. What are your thoughts on the WEF as a game change?
My first thought is, I don't know how many of you have read Kim Stanley Robinson's book. The title suddenly eluded me, but
it'll come back.
Yeah, I'll come back. But the reason I mentioned the book is that it's a novel, and it's broadly speaking about more or less surviving the times we're in. But there's a part there where something very closely related to the WEF features, and in effect they're taken hostage. That in effect a guerrilla group effectively, takes the world leaders hostage, and says, look, you're destroying the world. You're not facing up to the scale of the challenge. They don't harm them, but they sort of scare them into sort of saying, look, this is real. Like, stop with your conversation, stop with your great resets and your net zero pledges, and actually show us that you really mean this. So I only mention that because when I hear these great reset plans, I don't really have a great deal of faith in them, because they're not, the word I want to reach for is, they're not integral, in the sense that if they're only effectively bottom right action plans, if they're only about systems and structures without any commensurate notion of what human beings are living for in that context, what's happening to human relationships, what the overall narrative about the purpose of life is, then I don't really believe it will work. Because what we have at the moment is, even if governments have plans, so do corporations.
Yeah.
And they're very rarely perfectly aligned. So my sense is that the form of it, the morphology of the countervailing motion, by the story by which it turns out okay, that humanity somehow wakes up to itself, protects its only home, and gets its act together, will be a much more pluriform, sort of diverse, variegated phenomenon. It won't be a central action plan. It will be lots and lots of inspiring, localized actions which communicate with each other across the globe, not entirely independent of government, but in a more, let's say, polycentric governance spirit. That's a term by Elinor Ostrom. And it's a way of saying that I don't, the future that seems plausible and viable to me is not one where central governments are directing the show, but where local and regional bodies are cooperating with each other across countries, digitally communicating, sharing resources, both intellectual and material, and then the pattern of power will change to being more variegated like that. More polycentric is mentioned because, there's still central government. It's not, again, let's not be game denial about this. There will still be centralizing forces that control the military and the rule of law and so forth. But hope rests in more power to be spread and shared. So that's a long way of saying it's not where I place my hope.
No, certainly not.
It's basically it's a kind of technocratic action plan, and we've had lots of them before.
Well, that's exactly the point. And I think going back to the consciousness metaphysical area, I mean, the Schwab's pronouncements make it very clear that the transhumanism, fourth industrial revolution, Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, data gathering, it's the it and the interobjective. And it doesn't have, if you regard the human being as a machine, then it's a denial of interiority. It's a denial of the spiritual. And it's denial of what actually makes us human. At least that's my view. I mean, here's a book that I've been reading today, in fact, by James Tunney. He's written quite a lot about this, called Human Entrance to Transhumanism, Machine Merger and the End of Humanity. It's quite an eloquent book with a lot of historical references in it. And so I feel that the image you have of the human being is absolutely at the center of, and I think this is what you've been saying about spirituality and spiritual renewal. It's a central point, literally, because we experience ourselves as centers. And we're all talking about spiritually. For instance, B. Griffiths talked about return to the center, and being centered. That's all mindfulness is about. And so I think I like that very much. That anything going forward, I think you're right, needs to be local rather than global. I mean, this is all happening, but it's a question of whether there's going to be enough freedom within those bioregional, smaller scale operations. It's up to us to make that happen, I think.
Yeah, so there's two things there. The first is that I broadly agree. The other is that, you know, what are we really talking about when we imagine that there might be some kind of spiritual renaissance? Like, what would that look like? And will it happen fast enough? Because there is a bit of time sensitivity here, of course.
Yeah, totally.
Now, here's where the book that made the biggest impression on me in recent months is by Jeffrey Kripal, The Flip.
Oh, yeah.
And The Flip is a kind of a simple argument, really, that says we just have to realize, you know, we need a new theory of consciousness at scale. We have a kind of default theory of consciousness that sort of suffuses institutions and cultures that we don't reflect on much. But it's broadly a materialist view of consciousness that says it emerges from the brain and it's fundamentally biological. But he thinks it is conceivable that while some changes take hundreds of years and decades, intellectual fashion is a bit more fickle. And there is a possibility that, you know, a few good books here and there, a few, you know, Peterson-like superstars who sort of suddenly get a lot of attention. And by the way, Peterson's a whole conversation. I didn't mean to sort of tacitly endorse it.
Okay.
Just that kind of supernova of interest in a person who has a set of ideas, that can happen quite quickly, such that intellectual fashion means we suddenly think, aha, so consciousness is not what we thought it was. And what follows from that, right? Now, what follows from that is much of our view of what is suprapersonal or transpersonal becomes a bit more plausible. Now, that won't mean, I mean, one of the interesting things about Kripal is that he seems to think that whatever is on the other side, as it were, is quite amoral in nature. You know, he's not at all saying that it's all angels wishing us the best. His sense is that whatever is happening numinously is happening in a way that we may not, our intuitions may be a bit out of sync about. You know, it might be altogether more chaotic and crazy than we think. But in any case, it's a bit of a diversion. The point is that intellectual fashion can change such that our default cultural understanding of consciousness could shift within a generation. As it does, our access to spiritual life, our access to what beauty feels like and looks like, our sense of what is good and true will also alter in ways that are currently hard to conceive. But I think that's the way it might shift. It's like a sort of shift in intellectual fashion that somehow through social media mechanisms becomes a new norm of sorts, giving rise to new forms of collective practice, new patterns of value, which people will actually, you know, in the same way they care at the moment about massive views on TikTok for some random, you know, video, there may actually be a shift towards deeper patterns of intrinsic value. That's the hope, that somehow the shift goes in that direction. But concurrent with that and concomitant with that, there needs to be work on political and economic institutions that allow those cultural changes to sort of root down and become a new civilization. Otherwise, it won't work.
Won't get grounded. I mean, oddly enough, today somebody sent me an article entitled "The idea that everything from spoons to stone is conscious is gaining academic credibility." And it starts with a quote: "If you think about consciousness long enough, you either become a panpsychist or you go into administration." I mean, what we're trying to do with the Galileo Commission is exactly this. And the point of these essays that I referred to in the presentation, with these 50 plus essays, which are all short essays, they're just 1,000 words. And Marilyn, who's online, she's one of them, and Jeff Kripal, he's another. Eben Alexander. I mean, we've got a lot of interesting people, and if one of the issues, it seems to me, is that especially among academics and scientists, and you've actually said this yourself, is that people won't admit that they've had these kind of experiences and that spirituality actually means something to them, because they think they're going to be laughed at by their colleagues.
Yeah. So so again, going back to the beginning of the RSC project, I was a little bit of that mind too. There's the first essay I wrote, and that was on the slide I shared, called The Brains Behind Spirituality. It was in the RSA Journal in 2013. I opened there with a line that I think I got from Foucault's essay called What is Enlightenment, where he's actually quoting Kant, who says that the impact of liberal enlightenment was that if somebody walked into a room and saw you praying, you would be profoundly embarrassed. Right. And I feel as though I've managed to get over my embarrassment. I'm quite happy to concede to anyone now, I don't know what's going on. You know, everything from the existence of God to spirits to how the I Ching works to astrology, like I just don't know. I mean, it's not as though I surrender my epistemic judgment. You know, I'm still a skeptic in the right sense of wanting to understand what the mechanisms might be and what the kind of reality might be. But I'm very open to the possibility that our default understanding of reality is quite significantly wrong.
Well, Ian, of course, is arguing that at great length.
Yes.
Let's move on to a question from Pamela King. It has to come down to individual responsibility and juggling all the quadrants and pausing and modifying in a pragmatic way. We cannot mistake being articulate with knowing. I like that. We must combine book knowledge with street smarts. I think that's what you've been saying. We're individual bodhisattvas changing one by one, never forgetting that even though one person changing the world is futile, it's our only option. Well, of course, that's only part of the quadrants, I think, that you've been talking about, because less street smarts refers to activism.
Yeah, so I mean, I know that it's difficult to type questions and get the full sense of it, but I mean, so the term, I don't want to reach for the concepts too quickly, but in essence, I think the individual is a bit of an illusion, but not in the way that the sort of Buddhist strain of thought says it's an illusion. I believe that we're all uniquely precious, that there is a kind of unique self that is spiritually important. I think it's important to speak of the soul and not just the spirit. There is something about individuation that matters to me in the sort of Western Christian Judaic traditions, that you are somehow uniquely known to God and you have a unique path in life. I'm quite invested in that and committed to that. However, it's hard to read or practice in a Buddhist context and not become aware that the self is somewhat virtual, somewhat unreal as well. And somehow I think the spiritual story is navigating these two realities. The self is both unreal and fundamentally important at the same time. Now, why do I mention that? Because the reason I mention that now is that when I say I think the individual is a bit of an illusion, I don't so much mean it in that sense. I mean that the individual and the collective is co-constituted to such an extent that really the I and the we are constantly in a reciprocal, mutually reinforcing, shaping relationship. Why does that matter? Because what individuation means today is something like Carl Jung meets Elinor Ostrom. In other words, it's collective individuation that matters. It's finding your unique context in the context of the collective. It's not just about who am I vis-a-vis God. It's given the historical context, given this moment in history and the resources and abilities I have, including my social connections, who am I now? What am I to do? And that's ultimately a spiritual quest. That's the who am I question rendered social and historical, which is also a premise for Bildung, but that's not a conversation. And so the answer is, I don't think it's just about each of us individually tending to our own selves. I think it's finding the others and through the others finding ourselves. It's an altogether different proposition.
Yes, and I think Ian says this also in his chapter on consciousness. It's not one or the other. It's not the one or the many. It's the many and the one, right, or the individual and the wave and the particle. It's this complementarity.
Yeah.
Like. So I think that's so good.
It is good, and it's essential. So this is a whole conversation about some of you will know the sort of trope or the suggestion in conversation. It's not either or, it's both and, right? You often hear that. Like, it's stop making a distinction between, you know, we either need feminine energy or masculine energy. Somehow it's both and, right? But what's useful about Ian's work, and for those who don't know, Ian McGilchrist, neuroscientist and philosopher, quite famous for a theory of the impact of the brain hemispheres on human attention and therefore on human culture, recently released a new book where he goes into many philosophical quandaries in great depth. He actually goes a bit beyond this, as others have before him, but he does it very well. It's not either or both and. It's somehow, because even both and is a kind of oppression if you insist on it, right? What Ian's often doing is saying it's both and, but not equally. You know, very often it's yes, it's both of them, but it doesn't follow that they're equally important. One can often be more important than the other. And that sort of discernment really matters, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We'd love to have some live questions. I've got more coming up in the chat, but to have some more interaction. Robert Ulfton asks, is it possible the huge growth of interest in a great diversity of spiritualities in the last 30 years has occurred in parallel with a felt sense of loss of political agency within democracies? That's an interesting connection. I'm not quite sure whether I see it myself.
So I don't.
Robert Ulton, 2140.
Okay, yeah, all right. So he's saying, okay, so somehow, because we can't find the meaning and purpose through our political life, that's one of the reasons that our spiritual people are attending to spiritual matters more. I think that might be the premise or something.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah.
Possibly.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So okay. I think so look, I mean, this is going to surprise some of you, maybe, the answer. And I don't bring politics into this lightly, but I can only convey it very personally without any campaigning on my part. What happened to me in 2014 as a Scot who was born and raised in Scotland, has family there still, now lives in London. There was a referendum on Scottish independence. And although I couldn't vote, I thought it was right that I should make a call. Like, if I could vote, which way would I vote and why? And it wasn't at all easy, because I'm a very anglicised Scot. I'm not at all, I've never voted SNP, and all of that. Nonetheless, I did a lot of soul searching, thought a great deal about it, wrote a piece for The Guardian, which you can find. And I decided that if it were up to me, yes, I would vote for independence. Right now, things have changed since then. I'm not certain I would do the same again, but that's the decision I came to. Now, the reason I mentioned that and answered this question is the following few months, when I'd made that commitment and I, in effect, was campaigning for that outcome, were some of the most spiritually alive I've ever had. I was so alive. It really felt like this mattered. And I poured my heart and soul into it, which is odd, because prior to the decision, I wasn't at all sure. I can make the argument for the other side quite convincingly too. But I got into it and I mobilized my will and my soul into this purpose. And a big community gathered around, and I shared in the solidarity of that endeavor with them. And then I remember when the result happened, I was up in Scotland and was briefly crestfallen. And then life went back to normal, and it's water under the bridge. But I share that because that was no doubt that political moment of my life was a very spiritualized experience. It was very much about, again, your life and times, who you are in your current context, what means something to you, what are you bringing to this historical moment. And I think you become alive by making those commitments, albeit with all due discretion and discernment. So you become, you don't demonize the other side. You remember there's a bigger picture here, that there's a shared life prior to the political question and so forth. But nonetheless, deciding what matters to you releases a lot of energy. and in a way that can be mobilized for the greater good. Now, and if you don't feel you have that option, if you can't find a way to release that energy politically, yeah, I can see why that same energy would find a different outlet. So that is part of the issue. I mean, I'm politically quite homeless, as I imagine many of us are. It's just not clear to me that any political party or any movement is really speaking to the meta crisis as I understand it. The Green Party have their moments, but they have their own issues as well. So I'm very mixed up in that sense. I'm philosophically quite conservative in certain ways. I sort of respect tradition and history, and certain established institutions have a certain amount of dignity in them. By background, my parents were sort of left of center. I was brought up by my grandfather worked in a granite quarry and used to rail against Thatcher on the TV, but then I was enculturated in a kind of Oxford established institution and developed a lot of friends who saw the world differently. So like many people, I'm politically a bit homeless. I don't really feel I have a tribe. And it might be that if I did have a tribe, that's where I'd be putting the energy.
Such an interesting reflection, sort of the dynamism and the commitment. We got a question from Joan Walter here, who's part of the Galileo Commission steering group, saying that you mentioned metamodernity, and you've had extensive video conversations with others on YouTube about what metamodernism is and where it might be going. What are your thoughts about the relationship between metamodernity and developing a spiritual sensibility?
Okay, thank you, John. It's a good question. Well, in the essay, which you can find online, which is called Metamodernism and the Perception of Context, the subtitle is The Cultural Between, the Political After, and the Mystic Beyond. So this is a question about the mystic beyond in some ways. This is the part of metamodernism that's least developed. There is a great, for those who are very interested in this question, and I really do mean great essay online by Zach Stein called The Metamodern Return to Eros, I think it's called. And he develops in there a notion what he calls cosmoerotic humanism. And this is the most developed sort of metamodern spirituality that I've seen. What Zach's arguing is something similar to what Bonita Roy argues, and others as well, that we're in a phase of time where the sort of technological, cultural, social, economic, political changes are so tumultuous that the existing metaphysical structure sort of cannot hold. And our job is somehow, and it sounds really weird because how does one do this, but to weave a different metaphysical fabric with different, which is sort of what Ian's doing, by the way, Ian McGilchrist, in terms of different understandings of time and causality and space and matter and value and purpose, that all of these things one by one or together and have to shift in our sense of what they are and therefore who we are. So what's the relationship? The relationship is that metamodernism is really, I think, the theory and practice of what it is to be in a time between worlds. And by the way, David, I do say worlds and not paradigms.
Okay.
Because I'm getting at, again, all four aspects of the quadrant map.
Yeah, yeah, no, I understand that.
Sure, but I mean, just it's a worthwhile thing to ponder, because when you say time between worlds, it can sound kind of mystic or poetic, but it's actually quite empirical. You know, there are cleodynamics, it's called, a kind of a sort of quantitative study of history showing the converging pressures of buying and selling, the ecological resources that are used. There are people who study this, meta-historians who look at, again, patterns over time, and they see that this moment in history has many of the features that comprise things like the axial revolution, major shifts in consciousness that arise coextensively with major shifts in technology and economies. So in terms of what the relationship is, that's really the work. That's kind of where Perspectiva sits in some ways, is trying to have a sort of intellectually discerning spiritual view of the world that is metaphysically not just open, but potentially creative, that actually is trying to work for a different view of who we are and what reality is about, but in a way that's sort of grounded in the historical circumstances that we live in. Again, it's audacious, beyond us, but it feels like the work.
No, I agree. The great work. Dave Heinemann has an interesting question. What about, as Bayo Akomolafi says, surrendering human centrality? Whilst humans have a symbiotic role, maybe you overstate our agency. You qualified that. And I wonder if spiritual bypassing is rooted in a basic denial of anything bigger than us, a refutation of God, whatever you take that to mean.
So it's a great question. And the quick answer is just to agree with it. I think I probably have a humanist bias, a sort of clean bias. This term clean bias comes from Peter Lindbergh. It's a way of saying not so much that you recognize in yourself that you have this kind of prejudice. I grew up in a sort of, and was intellectually formed in a mostly liberal, secular, humanist context. So I do find that I overstate the importance of humans, and it is a bias, and it is maybe even a misperception of what's going on. Bayo, I'm a huge fan of, by the way, and I admire and even slightly envy his poetic brilliance. And he's right that we need to think of this in terms of he uses a very careful diplomatic language, more than human world. And that's clever because it's speaking to the sort of biosphere. Coronavirus was the more than human world, but it's also speaking to the kind of stratosphere and semiosphere and all of the more than human things that influence life. So the issue is, though, where is our responsibility, right? It is the idea that we somehow have to get out of the way, that what it means to be a good human today is to be less willful, less agentic, and more in reverie and witnessing the other forces in the world, including all the spiritual and mystical forces. Maybe. I can only confess that the question highlights a weakness in my own orientation, but so much so that I can't really speak to it further. It's like I agree, but I don't quite know what to do about it.
Very nice. I mean, my sort of response to that would also be to, I was talking earlier today about braiding sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer's incredible book on mutuality, and that seems to me that that giving and taking, the reciprocity, the mutuality, the sharing, the solidarity with all forms of life, that seems to me what we need to be able to recover, which is also a sense of the sacred.
Right.
And that's so there the human is situated within this larger ecological, eco-social context, and it's inherently sustainable at a deep level, I think, and nourishing.
Yeah. So David, you're right. That sounds like deep ecology. It may not be quite what you're sharing, but I mean,
yes and no. I mean, I knew Arnie Ness a little bit, but there's a subtle difference, I think, and also in the metaphors. I mean, one of the lovely concepts is honorable harvest. The honorable harvest is not clean pick of everything, so there's nothing left for anything else or anybody else. It's taking what you need, and then the rest goes back into the system or remains into the system to be recycled. So there are a lot of very subtle concepts here.
So just to say, I mean, I know that it's not fair to pick up one piece without getting the full story, but I mean, when I raised game denial, game acceptance, and game change, this kind of so it's like this. When I think of what might give hope, what might work out well, I think we have to contend with the full reality of, in this context, particularly the human predicament. And by that I mean visions of the future that depend upon all of us being great and good and kind, seem to me less credible and therefore actually less valuable at the moment than visions that contend with our fallibility, our temptations, our propensity to corruption, our underlying sins, quote unquote. Any vision that relies on us pressing the nice guy button, I think is not going to work. Any vision that keeps open the possibility that we can be better I'm all for that. But one that depends upon always being cooperative, always being kind, always forsaking more, makes me nervous, because it just doesn't ring true for the human beings that we are, certainly not at the scale of 8 billion plus.
No, I agree with that, but I think it's the principles. I mean, it's not as if the indigenous people don't have this give and take, and the but it also seems to me important in terms of values, because this is another area that needs renewal. Is the renewal of values, which really means going back to first principles, which you were talking about before. And just a couple of nights ago, and a few people on the call, I can see Bernard and Marilyn, for instance, were on this call with Neil Grossman, right. And he was talking about Plato and Spinoza, and the importance of virtue in public life, if I can put it that way. And I said that on the Scottish mace, you may know this, there are 4 words: wisdom, compassion, integrity, justice. And if those are obviously the moral ideals, as it were, but it seems to me that the political education and education in general needs to see how we can best embody those values, because our values then drive our behavior.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's just a question of what follows. That one shouldn't surrender one's ideals. By all means, pursue the world that's most true, most good, and most beautiful, and work towards it, and believe in our better natures and try to cultivate them. It's just that at the same time, we are where we are historically. There is an existential threat, slow burning one, but nonetheless there. And it's a bit like, again, to use a chess metaphor, since you invited me to, the clock is ticking. When we play chess, we don't have all the time in the world. We know that if we could think for an hour on this move, we might get it right, but we have to make it quickly. And it's a bit like that here. Any theory has to contend with the time sensitivity.
And the corruption. Right. And on the systemic. No. But anyway, here's another question, which is slightly different. This is Laurie. We seem to be talking about spirituality without reference to religion or religious institutions. Do we need to talk about secular spirituality to distinguish it from spirituality as defined by organized religion?
Good question. And so the answer there is, well, I'll reach for Exhibit A here. So this book here, which, by the way, I have lots of copies of, it's called Spiritualize. It was the sort of second edition of the report that came out of the RSA project. In there, I spent a great deal of time trying to define spiritual and spiritual sensibility. And I also speak about its relationship to religion quite a lot. The question's a good reminder, though. When I speak of the spiritual, I am including the religious within that. I don't mean spiritual, but not religious. Most of the time when I say spiritual, I use it as a broader umbrella that includes but is not subsumed by religion. Which is not to say it brings with it everything that's religious, but just that it's anything that is committed to a sort of holistic view of life as a whole, which most religions are concerned with. I do recognize that there are many factions. There are those who are spiritual but not religious, those who are religious but not spiritual, those who hate the word spiritual for being nebulous and undefinable. Others who think that by its very nature it has to be undefinable because it speaks to the ineffable. So all of that. I can only say that I hear the question. You're right that we're speaking mostly in general terms about the spiritual. The spiritual also includes the metaphysical, which is another register altogether. The religious, the spiritual, and the metaphysical all do different kinds of work. And then you got the mystical as well. So yes, there's a lot of work to be done on the terms here, but that's what it is to have a conversation. You have to roll with the ambiguity a little bit.
Totally.
Well, so there's so many different ways into this. So first of all, the references that came to mind when you were speaking, Jonathan Haidt's work about moral foundations and the sort of need to understand a greater plurality of valuing that gives rise to political results that we may otherwise find surprising. But then when you look more deeply at what are people hearing when, for example, Trump speaks, or when, for example, they're promised that we can take back control with Brexit, what's being felt and known by people? What is it reaching that we don't understand? I very much agree that there is unchartered empathy there, that there's much more scope to extend our political imagination and also improve our conversations by accepting that there are other ways of valuing life. So David Goodhart puts it in terms of the somewheres and the nowheres. You may be aware of that distinction, but that a lot of the liberal intelligentsia that runs the technocracies of most of the West are kind of nowheres. They're people who left home to go to university, then follow a meritocratic career path, and they define themselves in terms of their acquired identity, where they were educated and what they do. But there are many others who have a kind of assumed identity based on where they were born and who they know in their locales, and their sense of what matters in life is different. Now, the question is, that's the sort of context as I see it. So I share that sense that there's an entire way of viewing the world that is not inclined to think in let's say, meta-paradigmatically. In other words, not to think of the systems and structures at scale, but want to know what's in it for me, how does it speak to my life, and the challenges I face to whatever it is, feed the family, keep the job, retire well, or whatever. Now, what I can say is that I do see people working on that. So I mentioned Indra Adnan already, but the Alternative UK, which is a kind of political platform, created partly based on the learnings of Brexit. I think Indra's sister voted to leave, and she was just keen to understand that better, and that led to a kind of journey. She's actually working with communities that are quite close to what you described, and worth exploring her work. She's also an associate of Perspectiva. So although I don't do that work myself, I am in contact with people who are. I also know that among conventional political actors who are trying to win votes, there is by necessity a need to reconnect with these communities. So I think there has been that kind of earthquake and a realization that these people are not just the left behinds. It's not just that they don't get it yet and have to grow up, that actually they're valuing things and seeing things in a way that we can learn from too. I agree with that. How do you do it? Yeah, there the question is live. Is it my personal responsibility? That's another, we all have to ask that, where we are with regard to these questions. But I hear you. I mean, I accept that there is a premise there that's an important part of the picture that we have to attend to.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed. I'm also reminded we had Rabbi Michael Lerner on our platform in 2020, and his most recent book is Revolution of Love. And one of the things he analyzes there is the disconnect with the liberal intellectuals, particularly this phrase deplorables, and he said that people hadn't actually gone out to try and understand what the concerns of these people were and why they were thinking as they were, and just to dismiss them because they don't think like you, they feel like you as deplorables,
Right.
is arrogant,
Yeah.
and politically short-sighted.
Right. So I have difficulty with a lot of my friends and colleagues and even family sometimes, because, even now in a situation like Russia and Ukraine, where I think one can make a dispassionate moral judgment about the rightness of and wrongness of things. I think it's pretty clear that Russia is in the wrong, broadly conceived, that it is an expansionist, imperialist agenda that's grounded in one man's psychopathy, possibly. But even so, you have to ask the question: how does this look to Russia? How does this look to people inside Russia?
Yeah.
What is, this is again the chess player in me wants to know what the opponent thinks, and it will actually make moves accordingly. Which is why I'm sort of a functional liberal. I live like a liberal, but I think liberalism is intellectually bankrupt. Actually, I think it's got us to this point, and something new will have to arise that's very different. Now, will some of those resources come from the so-called left behinds? I mean, the deplorables was, I think infamously a line of Hillary's,
yeah,
Clinton's. But yeah, I think it's about the broader human story, not just in left behind post-industrial communities in the UK.
Yeah.
But as you say, the indigenous world, it's also it's a fascinating intergenerational question here as well, about whether this is a kind of generation where the young need to learn from the old, or whether it's vice versa. And anyway, that's another conversation, but I know there are more questions to come.
Yes, indeed.
Gosh, there's so much to respond to there. I mean, there are two things I want to mention. One is, again, it's not either or, it's both and, but it's not just both and. It's both and with a certain discrimination within that. I mentioned collective individuation earlier. That's kind of a lodestar for me. In other words, I don't believe in the heroic individual. I believe in the interdependent individual. I believe in the individual that relies on other people and looks after them and is looked after by them. And I don't think that we have to be terrified of collective action, but I do think we have to be cautious about it. In early 2018, I met with Jordan Peterson, who I mentioned earlier. And I think for him, collectivism really is a kind of existential threat. He sees a direct line from a kind of any desire at sort of living through the collective as a sort of direct line to the gulag somehow. And obviously I'm caricaturing, but that's often how he speaks. And I don't see it that way. I think individualism is just as dangerous. It's led us to ecological collapse. And it's not either individualism or collectivism. It's something that involves both in an intelligent, discerning way. I think we have to be careful about ignoring indigenous wisdom. I also think we have to be careful about valorizing it. Indigenous people also, rape and murder each other. It's not that simple. On the other hand, there's much to learn by forms of life different from our own. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. I think this question from Nick Coleman is going to need to be the last one. 2213. Is not this conversation itself a form of spiritual bypassing? Since the consistent assumption is that we will fix the crises, yet we have caused these crises. They aren't natural, they're artificial. They're due to the interference of our extractive and avaricious actions. I think what Terry Sexton will be talking about next week. Real spiritual engagement is when we get out of our own way and allow the innate, the spiritual, to express itself naturally. As we do less, it does more. Sounds like the Tao to me.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of going on in that statement. I wouldn't call this spiritual bypassing, personally. But nor is it in and of itself spiritually transformative, nor is it's a conversation, it's a cultural practice, and it's a cultural practice on a subject that is important. So it's a step towards overcoming spiritual bypassing for some, and probably not for others. I don't think the premise is that everything's going to be okay and that we're going to fix it. Far from it. I think the premise is the opposite. I think the default scenario is collapse and catastrophe, actually. I don't think it's inevitable. And I think it's better to live as if it were possible to imagine a brighter future. I say that with a certain amount of dissonance, enjoying a fairly affluent, comfortable, free Western lifestyle. But I also can sort of read the developments at a civilizational scale, and it looks grim. So I don't see that as the default. And I think the spiritual injunction to know reality more fully, whether that means, vis-a-vis John's question, spending more time with people very different from yourself who have different needs and desires, or whether it means sitting on the cushion and knowing your own mind better, or whether it means consulting the I Ching to access something more than human. I don't have the requisite expertise to know which of those and when and to what extent, but that's the direction of travel. It's a need to shift consciousness in some shape or form, but in a way that's historically grounded in the economic and political context we have.
That's a very good summary, I think, of our sort of, I think, a very generative conversation we've had this evening. I find it extraordinarily interesting, and there's been a great deal of equally interesting activity in the chat. Well, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank everybody, particularly Jonathan, for, as I said before, creating a very generative conversation about themes that really couldn't be more important. And I love the fact that you brought this integral perspective to things and brought in Hegel, Marx, Jean Gebser, whose work is so important. It's one of the gaps in my reading list. I have actually read a lot about him, but I've never actually read the Ever-Present Origin. I think it's about 600 pages. But unless we, as you argue, address the being, the doing, the having, the individual, the transpersonal, the social, the ecological, unless everything is tackled in a systemic way, tackled is the wrong word, approached even, then we're just not going to be up to the mark. And I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. And I hope you might be able to join us next week with Terry Sexton, because I think that'd be an interesting continuation of the conversation. But I understand that you may not be let off for the evening from your domestic duties. So thank you, Jerome, for the technical assistance. Thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you on another occasion very soon. So good night, everyone. Those in the States, have a very good rest of your day.
Thank you,
indeed, John down under, your day is just beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.